The Houses October Built is a 2014 found footage horror movie. It is set at a haunted house around Halloween. Um, I am a big horror movie fan. I haven't watched as many lately. Horror movies kind of got me into movies to begin with. But lately I've been branching out, so not as many horror movies this year. But of course it's still fun to go see a bunch. Halloween, the time is right, the vibes are right. And I had seen this movie before. I think I watched it a year or two ago. And this time around I liked it a little better. I found some more stuff to appreciate, which is nice. I think specifically I enjoy how it used the interview footage and stuff like that to kind of back up its main point. Um, and I think it knows what it needs to prioritize to make a successful found footage movie. I don't necessarily think it did a great job putting everything together, executing on some specifics. I don't think its time management is great. And there's some interesting stuff with how the documentary sort of aspect of it, the almost investigative reporting kind of style, meshes with the narrative, the way the characters actually interact in their story. So I think specifically, I really like the quote at the beginning and how that's expanded upon. Um, it, I don't have it written down here, but it was essentially saying, it was a quote from someone who was saying, I don't fear vampires, werewolves, I fear what man can do to man. And I think that's kind of interesting because I just saw Anatomy of a Fall a few days ago, and I'm not going to spoil it or anything. But Anatomy of a Fall struck me as a movie that has a very um, vague, perhaps, opening scene thematically. I remember watching that scene and kind of thinking, I'm not exactly sure what the point was, why some of the visual choices, stuff like that were made. Even though it was eventually made clear, and I got it. And I just think it's interesting, like, you can get such different styles of thesis statement in a movie, where this is very explicit with what it's trying to say. Um, it's not a subtle statement, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be. You can lay your ideas out there clearly, and it can still be effective. And I think the way it does lay out its ideas is largely through the progression of that interview footage. It kind of seems generally like half documentary, I guess, is how I would describe the movie. Because it's got not just that interview footage, which is sprinkled throughout. It kind of progresses from describing haunts as kind of like a fun pastime, something, that has an audience that goes to it for fun, to kind of enjoy themselves, maybe jump a little bit. But it's very fun. People seem to enjoy themselves. At the beginning, there's no malice. Then you kind of get a little further to, okay, maybe there's some more extreme stuff out there. Maybe there's some shady stuff happening. Maybe some haunt owners are okay with hurting people if the people are willing to be hurt. And then eventually wrapping it around with the final clip, which I really like, honestly. It's just kind of sad, a little bit frightening. And it really wraps back around to that quote at the beginning about, what you're really opening yourself up to in the event of seeking out some extreme thrills. The extreme thrills are at the hands of your fellow man. Fellow man is capable of some pretty heinous things. And that final clip gives some nice insight into what you might be dealing with. Someone who's projecting their own issues onto you. It's not a guarantee. I don't think the film is trying to argue that everyone working at a haunt is a psychopath. But I think it has a point to make that you're opening yourself up to a certain thing. You're asking for a certain thing. What kind of person is willing to give that thing? So I admire the way that's progressed. I admire the way that progression with the archival footage is also mixed with the fictional narrative of this group of friends seeking their haunts. Of course, it mirrors the progression of the interview footage as they're just starting out having fun, seeing some casual haunts that, they startle the woman who is easily startled. And then it kind of starts to progress into more sinister stuff that's a little bit more unsettling to the viewer, stuff that maybe tries a little bit harder, encounters with various people who certainly seem to have perhaps some anger issues, perhaps don't like their turf being intruded upon, the different festival organizers being mad at them at filming. And, then of course eventually they get what they want. They find the elusive, blue skeleton group. So, it's not the most advanced pairing in the world. You just mesh your narrative with your theme. But, it's nice. They fit pretty seamlessly, I think. And then there's also like this interesting kind of mesh between the two, between the documentary stuff and the fiction stuff. Because it seems pretty clear to me that they filmed a lot of stuff in real locations, talking to real people, not paid actors. So you kind of have like this interaction where you're watching almost an extension of like those interviews, where you're watching a practical example of what those interviewers were talking about, where you see these people having fun, you see that progressing to maybe some more concerning behavior, and then of course progressing to, the extreme, unrealistic, hyperbolic end, but an end that is fitting of the ideas presented. On the other hand, not so sure I like how the movie spends its time, I think would be the best way to phrase it. They have to establish their characters, of course. It is found footage, so you're somewhat limited with your choices, how you can present things. They have the right idea, I think. They have plenty of time with the characters hanging out, spending time together, having some camaraderie, indicating that they've got, a lot of time spent together, that they've got in jokes and stories, experiences. And it's the right way to do things, I think. I really like Hell House LLC. I couldn't help but think of some of the way those characters come across in that movie, which I don't think is like incredible, but I do think it's convincing. I believe that those characters would act that way. The stories, the in-jokes, the way they act towards each other doesn't feel like it's being improvised. It just feels like it's happening. But to me, this movie very much comes across like it's improvised. And it just makes sense, that's the simplest way to do something like this, where you want people to feel like they're just hanging out. When you're hanging out with your friends, it doesn't always come across well written. But of course, movies can't be 100% realistic, so that would kind of suck. I mean, we don't necessarily want to watch reality when we're watching a movie. And I think the way some of this stuff comes across is just not quite convincing to me. We also spend a lot of time with these characters hanging out, telling stories, spending time on the RV, which is good. I mean, you need to be familiar with the characters, you need to be familiar with their dynamic, you need to be bought in to care about them when they ultimately, So that's good. I would say like broad strokes, the film knows what it has to do. It has to establish the characters. It has to use these types of conversations to convince us that they know each other, they like each other. But the specifics, just the improv doesn't hit with me. I don't think it's very convincing. The movie's like 90 minutes, I think. 91 minutes, I believe. I just think it could have been shorter. I think we get too much time on the bus, too much time with people just talking. You need to have some, but I don't think the movie spends the right balance of time between haunts and conversations, and I think it gets bogged down a little bit. I think especially of that scene with the bearded guy on the bus talking to that girl. We already get that. I mean, he had a scene earlier in the movie where he just got up after sleeping with that woman. Does it really help? Probably not, because we already got that aspect of his character. Some of the conversations are helpful. I think the brief moment where they're having the conversation about whether real body parts were scary is kind of interesting, because it raises the question, sure, you can do extreme things. Does it matter? I thought that one bit was nicely helpful, but largely it just feels like the movie doesn't quite have it dialed in what they need to say. The interview footage is also kind of interesting because it interrupts the found footage aesthetic, because it kind of makes you think like, who's cutting in the interview footage? And I think it's fine because there's clearly a documentary framing. So the fictional story is kind of this pairing with the documentary, meant to enhance it, kind of provide an illustration of what it's going for. So even though it kind of interrupts the found footage continuity in a sense, I don't think that's a bad thing, because I still think it fits the main function of the movie, and that's the important thing. There are some good scares here and there. The clowns appearing in front of the headlights. The girl with the doll face is, kind of weird, kind of creepy. The scene in the alley is pretty nice. It's probably the best scene in the movie, I think. I don't think it's particularly scary, although I do think they inject a little bit of menace into the Blue Skeleton group, which is nice. You need some of that in order to feel like the characters are, emotionally in danger as well as physically, I suppose. But that's about it. I think slightly positively of it overall. I think I rated it a 55 out of 100. That sounds about right to me. I think it's perfectly okay. Could have been dialed in a little bit more to be a little bit tighter, and I would have appreciated that, but I still think filmmakers generally knew what they were doing, and they had a point to make, and they made decisions that fit well with that point. So they got credit for that.